The reason for this video is a long conversation online that I had with someone who wrote a comment to my YouTube video, and we were going back and forth in circles with regards to the definition of who is a Jew. A very old and incredibly controversial question, and I want to say a few words. As it turns out, there is a lot of misunderstanding on this topic, and this is one of the most complex topics from the Jewish point of view, in particular from how the Jewish law may define a Jew. So before I get to it, I was looking for some parallels outside of Judaism first, and I also wanted to discuss how others view what different nations viewed a Jew as. Is it a religion? Is it a nationality? Does it have elements of both? These are very complex questions, and when I was looking for parallels, I wanted to first see if our case is completely unique, or there is enough parallels in other cultures. And I think there are some parallels, so before I get to Judaism in particular, I want to discuss some general ideas. So one story I want to tell you is when there used to be a Soviet Union, which included many different nationalities and many different republics. So at some point there was a game, a soccer, what they call football in European football, right, is what they call in America soccer to distinguish from American football. So there was a soccer or football game in England, I think, and a team from the Soviet Union came and they won with a certain score, and the people of Great Britain used to say that the Russians won over them. So then the team members said, we're not Russian, we're Armenians. The team was called Ararat. Yeah, that's the same biblical Ararat, which is mentioned in two weekly readings ago in the context of the Noach's Teva. So this area of mountains is between Turkey and Armenia. So the the soccer team that the Armenians had at the time of the Soviets, maybe they still have it today, was called Ararat, and they won. So when they were called Russians, they were quite upset and said, we're not Russian, we're Armenians, right? It's a completely different nation, ancient nation that used to be part of the Soviet Union. Now it's a separate country. But there are other nations that are part of the Russia today that are actually completely different nations, but they are part of Russia. There are hundreds of nations like that. All kinds of nations in Siberia, like Yakut is one type of nation, and Chukchi, the ones that are very, very far closer to Japan actually than to Moscow. They're a lot further east. All kinds of nations. But they're treated as Russians. The reason I'm telling you all this is I was born in the Soviet Union and I came to America in the 80s, and I was called, here everywhere I was called Russian. But in Russia, the passports that, I didn't have a passport yet, I was too young, but the passports that my parents had, it said Jew. There was a nationality written in the passport in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and we had a Jewish nationality. As far as Russians were concerned, our nationality was Jewish. But when we came here in America, everybody thought that Judaism was a religion. So when we would say, what's your nationality? If I would say Jewish, I'd say, I understand your religion is Jewish, but what about your nationality? What's your nationality? So the joke used to go among the Jewish Russian immigrants to America that we used to be in Russia, we used to be not Russian. Russians did not think that we were Russian, we were Jews. And here in America, all of a sudden, we became Russian. By the way, speaking of England and the soccer game, the funny thing is that the British, it's also just as complex. There is Great Britain. Under it, as part of it, it's England. And a much larger, the full name of the entire country is United Kingdom, which includes the Northern Ireland. So we have three different definitions already. So a lot of times when a person from there comes to some country, he doesn't know where, if he looks for his embassy, he doesn't even know which way his embassy will be called in that language, in that country. Is it going to be some translation of United Kingdom, or Great Britain, or England? Because these are really three different entities, but as far as somebody in Russia is concerned, they're all English. It's all Anglia, all England, right? So a lot of times we don't understand the technicalities of which nationality, what's the group. It's very hard, it's incredibly tricky to define the nationality. Another interesting example from the post-Soviet times, So when the Soviet Union collapsed and 15 new countries appeared in its place, one of the smaller countries was Estonia. It's one of the smallest former republics of the Soviet Union. It still exists as a separate country, and obviously they wanted to keep their culture and their language and everything else, their nationality as a separate nation. But there were a lot of Russians there. And during the Soviet times, they spoke Russian. They didn't know Estonian at all, not their culture, not their language. They were completely Russian. They had their own schools. So what did the Estonians do? If they would give all these people full citizenship, then there would be too many Russians in Estonia, and the Estonians felt that they would not have enough preservation of their culture and their language and their history and their nationality. So what did they do? They offered these people either to leave, and they would pay a certain amount of money for those who want to leave, or they could stay and be just a permanent resident with the rights to work. But if they want to become part of the new country, New Estonia, they had to learn the language, pass an exam that they know Estonian history, basically to convert to Estonians, kind of, right? That would be the equivalent, basically. So in the next generation, their descendants already will be Estonian. So there are precedents in other countries that are sort of similar to Judaism, as I'll explain in a moment. That we're in a sense a nation, in a sense a religion, but this is a good precedent in my opinion. That we have this idea that Estonians want to preserve themselves, they're a small nation, they don't want to be overwhelmed by the Russians. And on the other hand, if the Russians accept enough of the Estonian culture, they become Estonian to an extent, or at least their descendants will be. And similarly, vice versa. There are people who lived for generations in other countries, but are still considered coming from certain roots. For instance, in Russia and in the former Soviet Union, there were a lot of Germans in all kinds of places. For instance, Volga region, that's very far from Germany. Even further, in Kazakhstan, there were quite a number of Germans. So all of them have a right to come back to Germany. Even though for generations they haven't had any German contact, they just come from German people. They don't speak German, they're completely assimilated into the Russian culture or the Kazakh culture, whatever it is. But when they claim that they want to come back to their roots, Germany will accept them. They're still considered German as far as the German law goes. The same laws exist for many various countries. I think Finland, maybe Korea, I'm not sure. There are a lot of countries that where they have large diasporas and they allow these people, even if it's for many generations. For instance, in Kazakhstan, there were a lot of Koreans living. And even if it's many generations later, they could still come back to Korea. They have a right, I think. Not sure exactly which countries, but there are a number of countries that have that kind of law. Now, in America, as I mentioned already, generally Jews are considered a religion more than a culture. And since most Jews are assimilated in America, I guess it makes some sense to say that they're more similar to Americans. You see, the problem, or rather, the uniqueness is that Judaism as a religion defines to a large extent the culture too. The language, the culture, we pray in Hebrew, we have a lot of laws that are not defined as purely religious laws. You see, in Christianity or other religions, generally the laws are purely religious laws. But Judaism defines financial laws and all kinds of other laws. So it's a whole life is full of Judaism. Judaism defines every aspect of life, not just the synagogue, not just the prayers and things like that. So that's why, to a large extent, a person who converts to Judaism becomes part of not just the Jewish religion, but the Jewish culture as well, to a very large extent. And of course, all of this is related to the land of Israel also, which plays an incredible role in Judaism. We always hope and pray that one day we'll all be gathered in the land of Israel at the time of Messiah, the Mashiach. So there's a separate discussion, which I'm not going to go into right now. My point is that Judaism is hard to define it only as a religion, but you definitely cannot define it only as a nationality. So those who say that it has to do with DNA, they're totally wrong. It's not just the DNA. So, for example, according to Jewish law, if a person converts to Judaism, but then drops the observance, they cannot go back. If they really converted, full-heartedly converted, the conversion is correct conversion, then even if they go back, they still remain Jews. So their DNA obviously still is the same DNA as it always was, the way they were born. Let's say a Japanese person converts to Judaism. So he's Jewish. Now, let's say he dropped observance. In order to convert, he had to accept observance of the commandments. But let's say he drops it now. Let's say he goes back to a different religion even. Still, potentially, he's still Jewish in certain aspects. As I'll explain in a moment. So this whole question of who is a Jew, it's a moot question. Well, first of all, let's define, number one is to define the words. Jew, Hebrew, all these words are actually not so simple as people assume. Today is, of course, a synonym. In English, Hebrew and Jew basically means the same thing for the most part. But originally, Jew, the word itself came from the word Yehuda, Judah. right? That was part of the 12 tribes, the southern part of Israel, where they had a separate kingdom. At some point, the Jewish states were split into two. The northern state was called Israel, and the southern state was called Judah. So technically speaking, most of us are in fact from Judah. It's considered that most of the Jews today come from Judah. So it's not incorrect that we're called Jewish. Now Hebrew comes from the word Ivri in Hebrew. Avram is called Avram HaIvri, but there are different interpretations exactly what this word means. And apparently in the original meaning, Ivri wasn't always the same as what we call Jew today. But certainly in various languages, the word Hebrew is a Jew. In fact, in Russian, that's what they call Yevrei is Hebrew. So that's how they call Jews in Russia. And like I said, in my passport, if I would have been older, I was 14 when we left Soviet Union, but if I stayed a couple of more years, I'd have a passport that would say Jew in it. But the Jew in Russian would be Yevrei, Hebrew. So the more correct translation would be Hebrew. And the same would be by any other Jew living, whether it's in Uzbekistan, a Sephardi Jew, it doesn't matter. They would still have nationality Hebrew in the Russian passport. So the Russians treat us as a nationality. A lot of other nations treat us as a nationality. In Poland, certainly, even before the World War II or even before the World War I, a Jew, whether religious or not, would not be considered a Pole. The Poles never considered Jews to be Polish. Now, a lot of times when the Jews from Poland come to America and they assimilate, if they've asked about their background, they say, oh, our background is that we're Polish. But they're not really Polish in terms of the Polish people do not consider them Polish. Okay, they lived in Poland for a number of years. It's true. And before that, maybe they lived in Germany like most Ashkenazi Jews, and before that in possibly Italy. And before that, of course, in the land of Israel. Like all of the Jews, except those who converted. There were very few converts, by the way, during the medieval times. In most countries, conversion was illegal, and if somebody converted to Judaism, they used to burn them at stake. So therefore, the vast majority of Jews just genetically happen to come from the land of Israel. But in practice, it doesn't really matter what percentage of Jews today come from the land of Israel and what don't. Because once a person converts, they become Jewish. So religion determines the nationality in a certain sense. And like I said, even if they later drop it, they still remain Jewish. So one interesting controversial case was a certain Jewish person from Poland who converted to Catholicism and became even a priest. Father Daniel was his name, at least his Catholic name that he took on himself. And at some point he wanted to stay in Israel according to the laws of the law of return, since he's Jewish by background, even though his religion is Catholicism. So they had all these discussions in the Israeli government and decided that he's not Jewish. But the rabbis, by majority at least, majority of rabbis actually considered him Jewish in potential, to the extent that a non-religious Jew is Jewish altogether, as I'll explain in a moment. The Jew could be only in some laws but not others. But at any rate, he would be considered Jewish to the same extent as, let's say, an atheist Jew or a Jew who is totally irreligious and doesn't observe much commandments. So while there is a dissenting opinion, I must mention, there are some rabbis who disagreed with this, but the vast majority of rabbis think that the Jew who converted to a different religion is still Jewish in that potential, in that respect. And therefore, in theory at least, he should be eligible to stay in Israel as a Jew. In fact, if one of the purposes of this law of the return was to save Jews from people like Hitler, then Hitler was killing Jews who converted to other religions as well. He didn't care. As long as a Jew, and by the German definition, certainly a Jew was a nationality. So he was killing all the Jews. But like I said, that has to be remembered that it's not only a nationality. The Torah itself calls the Jewish people a nation. We're called a nation. It's definitely true. But it's not the DNA in this case that determines a nation. And like I said, there are precedents like that in other nations too. It's not always the DNA, and it's not only the DNA. It's much more complex how do you define a nation. I'll give you another interesting example. I think it's just a cute example. You know that in a lot of communities of black people in America, they feel like they're a separate subgroup. There are certain places where mostly black people live. They have certain music they listen to. They have certain names they give to their children that are much more common in their community. Even the cigarettes they smoke. I read that in a book, there was this funny book called Freakonomics. And it was explaining that, the Chinese immigrants in 2 or 3 generations are completely American. Besides the DNA, they're completely American. They're not different from any other white American. Chinese American, after basically once they're born here, they're regular Americans. There's no difference whatsoever between them and the culture of Americans. But the blacks, they want to preserve a specific type of culture, a subculture. Not all blacks, obviously, but there are communities like that. A lot of black communities want to preserve their culture. So there was a story when a certain white woman wanted to be black. She liked the same music. She enjoyed the culture. She probably spoke their dialect, what's called black English, whatever. She wanted to be black. She considered herself black, but she was white. DNA was white. So there was a whole controversy. Can she call herself black? Is she allowed to be black if she is not physically black? Because she felt that she's part of that culture. Now, not every nationality, like I said, has to be separate. In America, it's altogether a mixing pot. It's a melting pot. It's very complex. Melting pot, by the way, the term comes from the Torah, from the Bible. It's a biblical term. Egypt is called the melting pot for the Jewish people, but it doesn't mean what they mean in America, though, by this term. They mean that the cultures basically become part of one group. You know, there was some fear that during World War II, the Americans who come from German roots might not want to bomb Germany, or Italian Americans might not want to bomb Italy. But there was no problem whatsoever. They did not feel the attachment to their previous lands. Now today it's somewhat different. A lot of people in America do not really want to assimilate, and they keep enough of the old culture and enough of the affiliation of where they come from. So coming back to Judaism, there's no question that from the religious point of view, a Jew is defined by the religion. And as I said, any nationality, a person from any nationality can join Judaism by converting. However, converting is not a piece of paper that you sign. Orthodox Jews do not accept the conversion of Reform Jews, where you basically just join the club. We only accept a conversion that basically accepts it's a huge change in a person. A convert basically becomes fully Jewish in every respect, in almost every respect. Right? This person now has to keep all the commandments, and like I said, the commandments of the Torah also determine the culture of Jews to a very large extent. That doesn't mean, of course, that Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews have to enjoy exactly the same music. A lot of times the exact singing in a synagogue where the Jews come from, let's say, Arab countries, Syrian Jews per se, or Iraqi Jews, or Jews from Libya, their singing in the synagogue might be slightly different than the singing of Jews who come from Europe. So I didn't mean that all the culture is exactly the same. We have slightly different cultures, but we all consider ourselves part of one nation. After all, even when there were 12 tribes, original biblical times, when there were 12 tribes, they also considered each one a kahal, what's called in Hebrew, a separate congregation. Each one had its own main court, Sanhedrin, what they call from the Greek term Sanhedrion, right? The main court, the Supreme Court. Besides one Supreme Court for all the Jews, there were also Supreme Courts in every tribe. Just like here, for instance, in America, there are states, right? Each state has its own laws, but there is also all Americans. So what I'm trying to say is that depending on how you define the nationality, you could say that all Jews come from slightly different nationalities, but we're all Jewish. Or you could say that we do have just one nationality. The truth is that, like I said, it's very tricky to define a nationality. Just like I mentioned already with Estonians, with certain blacks in America, with descendants of Germans who lived in Kazakhstan, all of these things are basically making the question so complex. But in my opinion, the whole question of who is a Jew is a moot question, because in every question that you ask a Jew, usually, I mean, besides that there are disputes, as they say, if there are two Jews, there are three opinions. Besides that, there are also differences. There are also chilukim, what we call. Like in every question, you have to specify where the question applies. How do you practically apply it? So, who is a Jew? You have to say, well, in what respect? Depending on what you're asking, it might be that the answer is a person might be Jewish in some respect and not Jewish in another respect, for example. So, first of all, with regards to the law of return, like I said in Israel, it was the law that was not created by Orthodox Jews, it was created by the Israelis, and for the purposes of whatever they had, including, for instance, to save people from a situation similar to Holocaust. So they don't have to define a Jew halachically in that respect, right? After all, a person whose father is Jewish and mother is not, is halachically not a Jew unless he converts. But Hitler would have killed him, so he should be able to maybe go to Israel and save himself that way, right? So my point is, I'm not going to discuss what Israel considers to be Jewish in terms of being able to come back to Israel and have a right to move there and become a citizen. Right? Mostly, there are some cases when people become citizens when they're not Jewish in Israel, but mostly the people who become citizens in Israel, if they come from other countries, they come according to the law of return. So like I said, that law has nothing to do with halachic aspect, with the Torah aspect. But the question is, what do we consider a Jew? Who do we consider a Jew in terms of what the halakha, the Jewish law, defines? So the question is incredibly complex, because in some laws, even a Jew who is totally assimilated is still considered a Jew. So as long as a person is born from a Jewish mother or converts to Judaism, even like I said, if they dropped the religion later, as long as they converted correctly, they will be Jewish forever in terms of certain laws. One of such laws would be if he does what's called kiddushin. Kiddushin is a kind of engagement. It's a marriage process. It's the beginning of the marriage process. Usually, it's done very similar to the way the non-Jews do it, and that is that a ring is given. Only that we don't exchange rings. It's just the man who gives the ring to the woman. So that procedure is done in front of witnesses, and he says that this way he's marrying her. He's doing. It's not really a full marriage. Marriage is what we call chuppah in Hebrew, but rather it's the first step of marriage, kiddushin, or erusin as the Bible calls it. So this process can only be affected by two Jews. If he or she is not Jewish, this process has no effect. But if a Jew did it, and let's say the woman later decides to marry someone else, she has to have a get, which is a Jewish divorce bill. So the consequence of a person being considered Jews in respect to that law, if, for instance, a Jew gave a ring in front of two witnesses to a Jewish man to a Jewish woman, that will work. That process will make her engaged, and therefore now, if she wants to divorce, she needs to get a Jewish bill of divorce, a get. On the other hand, if it would be a non-Jew, halachic non-Jew, who would do the same procedure, then this procedure has no effect. The woman is free; she could marry anybody she wants. She's not stuck with him, and he doesn't have to give her a get. There's no way a non-Jew can give a get anyway. So that's the real difference in that law. But let's say there is a different law, what's called yibum and chalitza. If a person died without children, then usually today, especially by Ashkenazim, we do what's called chalitza, the second procedure. It's all described in the end of the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the what we call Pashat Kiteitzeh, at the end of Pashat Kiteitzeh. So it says there that if a brother dies childless, one of the brothers either marries the widow or releases her through the procedure of chalitza. She takes off his shoe in front of people and says certain things. That's the procedure. So today we do usually the chalitza. We don't do yibum kimiat at all. Maybe some Sephardim still do it. So the point is that if, let's say, a person had a brother who converted to a different religion, there was already a dispute if in such a case a procedure of chalitza is needed. So in this law already we have some differences of opinion. And in particular, the question was also with regards to completely non-religious Jews, right? Are they considered a brother in that respect? Then there are all kinds of benefits that Jews do to each other. It's a kind of, I guess, members of the club that they all have specific benefits. It's not unfair to non-Jews, in my opinion. For instance, the fact that you could lend money at interest, it's sometimes a good thing for a lot of people. I mean, for instance, when I borrowed money from a non-Jewish bank in order to be able to buy a house, I was very happy. It's a reasonable percentage, and I wouldn't be able to buy a house in any other way. But when it's to Jews, if the bank would be Jewish, I'd have to make a special arrangement, what's called the heter iska. You cannot just simply borrow at interest from another Jew. So these laws are quite complex, what is considered interest. But my point is that there is an opinion that a totally irreligious Jew, or certainly a Jew that converts to another religion, maybe you could charge him interest. Again, like I said, it's not a question of being unfair. You cannot steal from non-Jews, for instance. The Torah doesn't allow us to steal from non-Jews. But here it's a mutual agreement, right? If a person borrows money and they agree that he'll be paying percentage, I mean, everybody is doing it today. It's only the special law that between two Jews, the Torah forbids this. I'll mention something that's not really related to this video, but just an interesting point that Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, a very important rabbi, a student of the Vilna Gaon, used to say that today, for a non-Jew to be righteous, they basically choose what is right in their eyes, what is good. They don't have the halachic, specific Jewish kind of law. So any non-Jew that wants to be righteous, be my guest. There's great possibilities. But for a Jew, even if what he does seems to be righteous, if it's not halachically correct, then it's not righteous. So for example, let's say somebody asks me for money to be borrowed. He really needs money and it will help him. And I cannot afford, because of inflation, to give him an interest-free loan. So if it would be two non-Jews, or a Jew and a non-Jew, nothing wrong with it. In fact, it might be a mitzvah too, to help somebody who needs the money and he's willing to pay the interest. The interest is maybe not so much, and maybe like equivalent to the inflation, for example. But if it's two Jews, they just can't do it unless it's done in a way that it's not really interest. It's called heter iska. I'm not going to go into this right now. It's a kind of halachic loophole which doesn't fully guarantee the interest. So a person might never pay you the amount of money he borrowed. Only that way you could borrow from a Jew can borrow from other Jewish banks. So these laws, like I said, are only applicable to Jews. It's not a question of being unfair to non-Jews. In a way, it's a question of there are specific laws for this group of people, and the Torah defines these laws. So there are all kinds of laws like that that apply to only Jews. In particular, let's say a person is sick but not in danger. It's a not life endangering situation. So we're not allowed to break Shabbat to do some work on Sabbath in order to help somebody who is not in danger. Just a person who is regularly sick, but without any danger. But a non-Jew, we're allowed to ask. So again, we have to define who is a Jew, who is a non-Jew in terms of that law. So there are laws like that galore, when there is differences between Jew and non-Jew, all kinds of laws. And the differences, like I said, may depend on the opinion and also on that what could be considered a Jew for some law, but not be a Jewish for a different law. That's how complex it is. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're asking who is a Jew, the answer should be depends. In halachic context, a person who is born from a Jewish mother or converted to Judaism in a kosher way, then they remain Jewish no matter what in terms of the potential. So they could, in theory, marry a Jew. They could, we would want them to keep the commandments. That's another big consequence. I would say that's the main consequence when it comes to Jews and non-Jews, because from non-Jews we're not asking them to keep the Torah commandments. If a non-Jew comes and says, I want to do righteous things, so you'll tell him, fantastic, be a good Ben Noach, a descendant of Noach, what's called, right? That's the 7 Noachite laws, which are general laws that include things like don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery. So these are general laws. But if a Jew comes and says, I want to be righteous, a rabbi will have to tell him, in order to be righteous, you can't just be a good person. It's not enough. You have to keep Shabbat, you have to keep Kashrut, all kinds of laws, ritual laws. So that's, I think, the main consequence, who is a Jew. So in that respect, anybody who is born from Jewish mother is potentially a Jew. Because if that person would come to us and ask us, what do I do if I want to do good? We'll tell them to do good, you have to keep the commandments. There's no other way around it. We have to keep the Jewish law to be good. But only if you're born Jewish or you convert to Judaism. Anybody else who comes, a non-Jewish person who comes, then even if they have some Jewish DNA, it doesn't matter. They may have 3/4 Jewish DNA. Let's say his mother's mother was not Jewish, but everybody else, all his other grandparents are Jewish. Still, unless he or she converts, this person is not considered a Jew according to halacha. The Jewish law defines the birth by mother, the matrilineal, what they call descent. I think that's the technical term. Matrilineal descent of who is considered Jewish. So in that respect, like I said, even if a Jew converts to another religion, even if a Jew is completely irreligious, even if a Jew is an atheist, they're a Jew in some sense, in some potential sense that we would want them to be Jewish and keep the commandments. That's the potential religion that, according to the way we understand, that's the definition of the Torah of who the Jewish nation is in potential. But does it mean that religion is Judaism? Obviously, an atheist or a Jew who converts to, let's say, Christianity or some other religion, their religion is not Judaism. But we would consider them a Jew in some respect, like I said, and the potential that they should, if they ask us, we would tell them they need to come back to their religion, they need to keep Judaism. But to summarize my entire speech, that is, there are precedents where different nations are formed. What used to be one nation can become many, what used to be many nations can become one, to a larger or smaller extent, like with America and some other nations. The melting pot type of nations. And Judaism defines a Jew mainly based on the religion, which includes culture and many other aspects. But also we are called a nation, we are called all one nation, the Jewish nation. And on this I'm going to end for today, and if you like it, you can subscribe to our channel.